We're going to continue graphing tangent. What we're going to focus on today is the period. The period is based off of our frequency. Remember, b is our frequency value. So the period would be pi over b, and that's when it completes a full cycle. So that means with our first example, our frequency is 3. So if we're trying to find the period, it would be pi over 3. Now, when we're coming up with our table of values, what we have to do is we have to remember that for tangent, the table of values start with negative pi halves, then negative pi fourths, 0, pi fourths, and pi halves. Our y values, it starts undefined, negative 1, 0, 1, and then it ends undefined. Now, that would be a normal negative pi halves to pi halves is a period of pi. What we're doing is we're taking a third of that. That means we're going to divide each of our theta values by 3. So when we're creating the table, what we have is we have negative pi over 6, negative pi over 12, 0, pi over 12, and pi over 6. That right there would be our theta values. We're going to start with it being undefined. We're going to end with it being undefined. Notice that we have a midline of negative 1. So that means we're subtracting 1 to each of our values. So instead of negative 1, 0, 1, we're subtracting 1 from each of them. So we get negative 2, negative 1, and 0. So when we graph this, we have pi halves, we have negative pi halves. I'm going to go up to 2 and negative 2. I want to make sure that I'm drawing my vertical asymptote. And then I'm going to plot my points. So I have negative pi 12ths and negative 2. I have 0, negative 1. I have pi 12ths and 0. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the lines approaching the asymptote. So looking at letter B, when we're trying to figure out our period, we use our frequency of 1/2. So it's going to be pi divided by 1/2. We multiply by the reciprocal to get 2 pi. So that means what we're doing is we're doubling each of our values in the table. So when we come up with our table of values, instead of the negative pi halves, we're timesing it by 2. So we have negative pi. Then we have negative pi halves, 0, pi halves, and we have pi. This distance right here, if you're looking at it, negative pi to pi is a distance of 2 pi. That's why the period is 2 pi. Now, if we're looking at our A value, it's 2. Remember, our amplitude is always the absolute value of A. So we're multiplying each of our values by 2. Now, obviously, undefined, we're going to start and end with that. The negative 1 becomes negative 2. The 0 stays as 0, and the 1 becomes a 2. We're going to remember to put our vertical asymptotes. And we're going to plot our points. Now, looking at letter C, we're going to do the same thing. We're first going to find our period based off of our frequency. So the period is pi over 2. That means we're going to take each of our theta values and we're going to divide it by 2. So I have negative pi fourths, negative pi eighths, 0, pi over 8, and pi over 4. Now with this right here, notice that we have a 1 and we're subtracting our tangent value. Now, obviously that does not affect it being undefined, but when we plug in a negative 1, what we're doing is we're subtracting a negative, so we get a 2. When we plug in a 0, we get a 1, and when we plug in a 1, we get a 0. Now, if we're looking at this is a little bit different than the last two. With this one right here, when we're looking at our numbers, what we notice is that the values don't go up like the last two. We're starting it at 2, we're going to 1 and then 0. So our tangent curve is going down in this case. What's causing it to go down is the tangent is actually negative. Okay, let's look at 3 more. If we're looking at letter D, we see that our frequency is 1/3. So in order to find the period, it's going to be pi divided by 1/3. We multiply by the reciprocal and we get 3 pi. Meaning that what we're going to do is we're going to take each of our theta values and we're going to times them by 3. So that gives us negative 3 pi over 2. Negative 3 pi over 4. 0 is nice because it stays the same. 3 pi over 4 and 3 pi over 2. We start with it being undefined. We end with it being undefined. When we plug in a negative 1 for the first one, notice that we're adding 4. So this becomes 3. When we plug in a 0, we get 4. When we plug in a 1, we get 5. So we have our vertical asymptote. We're plotting our points. And we get our graph. Now for the next one, we have a decimal. Remember, 0.1 is the same thing as 1/10. So when we're trying to find the period, we're going to go pi over 1/10. And remember, we multiply by the reciprocal, which would be 10 pi. So that means we're multiplying each of our values by 10. So we have negative 5 pi, negative 5 pi over 2, 0, 5 pi over 2, and 5 pi. We start with undefined, we end with undefined. When we plug in a negative 1, we're going to get 6. When we plug in a 0, we get 5. And when we plug in a 1, we get 4. So hopefully you notice that in this case right here, our tangent is negative, and that's why it's going down. I'm going to go by 2's. And I have 6, 5, and 4. And for our last one, we have a frequency of 2. So in order to find our period, we're going to go pi over 2. meaning we're going to divide all of our values by 2. So when we divide it by 2, we get negative pi over 4, negative pi over 8, 0, pi over 8, and pi over 4. We start with undefined, we end with undefined. When we plug in a negative 1, what we're doing is we're timesing it by 3 and then subtracting 1. So that gives us negative 4. When we plug in a 0, we get negative 1. And when we plug in a 1, we get 2. Remember the vertical asymptotes. So we have negative 4, we have negative 1, and we have 2.